It has been estimated that the human brain has on average 86 billion neurons, and the spinal cord has 69 billion neurons. Together, these two organs make up the central nervous system of the human body. If the human body were like a small city, you might think of the digestive system as being like the central processing plant that takes in energy in one form and turns it into another, the way that some electrical plants burn coal to produce energy. The integumentary system would be like a wall that surrounds the city to keep invaders out. And the immune system could be like a police force that monitors the city for dangerous and rogue cells. The circulatory system might be like a transportation hub, moving materials from one part of the city to the other. In this metaphor or analogy, the central nervous system would be like the city council, a collection of bodies that stores information about the city and its environment, makes decisions to help the city run effectively, and coordinates city activities. In this chapter, we'll be exploring the organization and functions of the central nervous system. Your objectives for this video are to state the components of the central nervous system and describe their functions, to name the four main regions of the brain and state their main functions, and to distinguish between white matter and gray matter and state their arrangement in the brain and spinal cord. So based upon our work in previous chapters, we know that the human nervous system has three main functions. You have sensory function, which allows the body to detect stimuli or changes that are happening both within it as well as around it, so outside of it. Examples of this, we've all eaten too much at one point and had that uncomfortable feeling around our stomach. Your sensory division of the nervous system allows you to detect that. You also have the motor function. And with our motor function, we're getting movement of our muscles so we can do things like digest food, constrict blood vessels, or run across a room. These functions also allow us to secrete substances like oil or hormones or sweat by our glands. So both the sensory and motor functions here are controlled by the peripheral division of the nervous system. The third function is called integration, or you might think of this as information processing. And this is the domain of the central nervous system only. Integrative functions include interpreting sensory information, planning and monitoring movement, homeostasis, maintenance, higher mental functions, those types of things. Occasionally, I will use the abbreviation CNS to represent the central nervous system and PNS for the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is composed of two organs, the brain and the spinal cord. Tissues associated with these organs include nervous tissue, epithelial tissue, and specific types of connective tissue. The main function of the central nervous system, again, is to control a number of body functions. Again, this involves interpretation of sensory information, planning and monitoring movement, maintaining homeostasis, and a whole host of higher mental functions. Development of the central nervous system begins around the third week of development for a human embryo. Human embryos are composed of three layers of cells. First, you have the ectoderm, which is depicted in green here. This is the outermost layer of the embryo. Ecto is a prefix meaning outside. This layer will develop to form structures like the skin, the hair, and the nails. Deep to that, in purple, is the mesoderm. Meso, M-E-S-O, is a prefix meaning middle. The mesoderm will develop to form muscles in the skeleton. Finally, we have the endoderm, which is depicted in yellow here. This layer will develop to form the body systems that are deepest in the body. Endo is a prefix meaning inside. So we're talking about systems like the digestive system and its associated organs, the respiratory tract, and other internal systems. The red dot that you see in the middle of this embryo is called the notochord. So it's right here. This is the notochord. It's kind of a flexible support for the embryo, and it will eventually become the vertebral column. Between weeks 3 and 4 of development, the ectoderm and the mesoderm of the embryo expand, and they begin to fold inward, making a thickening on the surface of the embryo, which you see here, called the neural plate. When the plates fuse together, a tube called the neural tube is formed. So here's the neural tube. The neural tube eventually becomes the central nervous system. I won't go into much detail here, except to say that the neural tube can be divided into 3 regions. The forebrain, which is this olive-colored structure, it eventually develops to become the cerebrum and the diencephalon in an adult. The cerebrum in this image on the right is illustrated by the taupe covering of the brain, and the diencephalon is this blue mass that you see here that's deep to the cerebrum. This portion of the neural tube is called the midbrain. The midbrain eventually develops to become the midbrain, this kind of pedestal that the diencephalon is sitting on top of, and the midbrain also develops to become part of the brainstem. Then you have the hindbrain here, and the hindbrain develops to become the remainder of the brainstem, as well as this little mass of neural tissue here called the cerebellum. And yes, of course we're going to go through the parts of the brain, and you will need to know the major parts and their functions for your next exam. Oh, one more very important thing. You may have heard of neural tube defects. These are problems that arise when the neural tube does not close properly, leaving the embryonic brain exposed to amniotic fluid. If the forebrain or midbrain areas do not close completely, anencephaly may result. Anencephaly is a condition in which the brain fails to completely develop, like you see in this ultrasound image here, or it doesn't develop at all. And this is always fatal for the embryo. Spina bifida results if the neural tube does not completely close on the lower end, inferior to the hindbrain. In spina bifida, the spinal cord and spinal vertebra do not develop properly in utero. Sometimes a sac of fluid protrudes through an opening in the back, and a portion of the spinal cord may be trapped inside. This may be corrected surgically, but infants with spina bifida may experience paralysis of the legs, loss of bowel and bladder control, or hydrocephalus, that is, water in the brain. Learning disabilities are also associated with spina bifida patients. Neural tube defects are preventable by including enough folic acid in the diet. All women of childbearing age should consume a minimum of 400 micrograms of folic acid in their diet daily, as this vitamin is not stored in the body. But we now know that it is important to preventing these types of problems in embryos and infants. So the brain is often called the supercomputer of the human body because it either directly or indirectly controls most of your body functions. This soft, whitish-gray organ is located in the cranial cavity, and it's superior and continuous with the spinal cord. The brain weighs approximately 3 pounds, and it's composed mostly of nervous tissue, but there is some epithelial and connective tissue associated with it as well. In fact, the brain is covered by 3 protective connective tissue sheaths called meninges. Although the majority of the brain is composed of nervous tissue, there are some internal cavities that are called ventricles, and they're filled with a special filtrate of blood plasma called cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. Now, the brain has huge and constant requirements for oxygen and glucose. Unlike muscle tissue, it can't store the oxygen. There's no myoglobin here. It can't store the glucose either. So that means there's no glycogen. So that has to be a constant supply. We know that after about 20 seconds, if circulation is cut off to the brain, oxygen stores in the brain are depleted. And you know what that means. Less ATP. Without ATP, neurons start to die. So after about 20 seconds without blood flow, this is when people usually lose consciousness. They pass out. Within about 4 minutes of oxygen deprivation, brain cells, neurons, may start to die. And the longer that oxygen is cut off to the brain, then the more cells die, and the less likely it is that people will recover from the injury to their brain. The adult brain is divided into 4 main regions. The first one is called the cerebrum, which is represented by this taupe, kind of wrinkled fabric looking layer. Deep to that, we have the diencephalon in blue. I don't know why, but when I see this structure, I think about the xenomorphs, those aliens from the Alien movie. It's just that these diencephalons are not quite as long, so maybe that'll help you remember it. And then you have the diencephalon sitting on top of a pedestal. This purple structure is called the brainstem. And then this last structure here, this is called the cerebellum, or the little brain. Let's talk about these in just a little bit more detail and look at their functions. So as I mentioned on the last slide, the cerebrum is this kind of gray, wrinkled looking layer. It's the superior portion of the brain, and it's actually divided into left and right halves, which are called cerebral hemispheres. In this image, you're looking at the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere would be on the other side of your computer screen. The hemispheres are divided into 5 lobes called the anterior, occipital, parietal, temporal, and insular lobes. We'll look at those in another video. You'll also want to remember that the cerebral hemispheres are associated with your higher mental functions, functions that are associated with consciousness and involve multiple areas of the brain. So we're talking about things like learning, memory, personality, emotion, thought, language, and of course consciousness. We know that this part of the brain is also involved in sensation and movement. The diencephalon was the blue mass that's deep, deep, deep inside of the brain. It's like the central core of the brain. And there are 4 distinct structural and functional parts that we'll look at in another video. For right now, I'd like for you to know the functions of the diencephalon. One major function is processing, integrating, and relaying information to different parts of the brain. So if you look at it, it's sitting right in the middle of the brain. So that means that information that's coming from the body along the spinal cord, it's going to travel up the brainstem, then it's going to get to the diencephalon. The diencephalon will do some preliminary integrating, and then it's going to either relay that information to higher portions of the brain or not. So it actually helps to filter some of the information that's coming from your body up to the brain. And likewise, signals that need to go to the brainstem and spinal cord, they also have to go through the diencephalon almost completely. So that means that there's a lot of processing that happens here. We also have a portion of the diencephalon located right around here That's involved in a lot of your homeostatic functions. This is where the hypothalamus is located. And as you'll see later in these lectures, there are a lot of regulatory functions that happen right here in this part of the brain. The diencephalon also helps to regulate your movement, and it's the center that controls some of your biological rhythms, like your circadian rhythm. Next, in purple here, again, that's the brainstem. All of this is the brainstem, and it's continuous with the spinal cord. So it's going to connect the brain to the spinal cord. A lot of basic involuntary homeostatic functions are located here in this part of the brain. You'll also find that the brainstem is involved in controlling certain reflexes as well. It monitors movement, which is really not a surprise because it's so close to the cerebellum here. Okay, and information that's coming from parts of the cerebrum that are involved in planning and executing movement, they've got to go through the brainstem to get to the rest of the body. So this is not really a surprise. You also have integrating and relaying information as a function of this part of the brain as well. Finally, we have the cerebellum here. It's the posterior and inferior portion of the brain. And there are two hemispheres for the cerebellum. You have the left, which you're looking at here, and the right, which would be on the other side of your computer screen. Your cerebellum has a lot of functions that are related to movement. For example, it's involved in your ability to maintain your balance and posture. It also has some roles in motor learning, so planning, refinement, and coordination of movements that are repetitive and complex, like playing the piano, playing the violin or a guitar, or maybe repetitive movements like how to dribble a ball, do a layup, hit a tennis ball, or perfect your golf swing. All of that's happening here in the cerebellum. It's doing the refining for that and the coordinating portion of those movements. In more recent years, we've learned that the cerebellum is also involved in some cognitive functions. It appears that the cerebellum may actually refine some of our thoughts, believe it or not. And we now know that it also is involved in refining our ability to speak, the motor movements associated with making words. Of all of the parts of the brain, we know that it's possible to live a somewhat normal life without the cerebellum. So the second portion of the central nervous system is the spinal cord. Just to orient you with this picture here on the right, these off-white bars that you see here, these are ribs. And you'll remember the ribs articulate with the spinal vertebra. So this is part of a vertebra. And they've basically been sliced through. The spinal cord runs through a central foramen called the vertebral foramen, and that's what you're looking at in this space here. Okay, this is the spinal cord. You can see little nerve rootlets coming off of the sides here. Okay, so this is a long tubular organ enclosed in the vertebral cavity. It's continuous with the inferior brainstem. It's not as long as you think. It's only about 17 to 18 inches, and it's less than half an inch in diameter, so it's really quite thin. The main function of the spinal cord is to connect the brain with the peripheral nervous system. In the middle of the spinal cord, there's a tiny canal called the central canal, and it's continuous with the brain's ventricles. This central canal is filled with cerebrospinal fluid, just like the ventricles of the brain. Nervous tissue is sometimes described as gray matter or white matter based upon the way it looks. Gray matter is typically found in the brain and spinal cord, and it consists of neuron cell bodies, dendrites, and unmyelinated axons. A lot of your integration and information processing happens in the gray matter. So in the brain, we see gray matter as the first few millimeters on the surface of the brain. This is called the cerebral cortex. We'll also find gray matter deep within the brain in areas that are called nuclei. In the spinal cord, our gray matter forms an internal butterfly type shape that's easily recognized here. And just like with the brain, this is where a lot of information processing is going to happen. Now, this material that you see here, this is called white matter, and it's found in both the brain and the spinal cord. And whenever you see white matter, I want you to think signal transmission. That is the main function. So in the brain, we have lots of white matter. It's organized into little bundles called tracts, Tracts, and all it's doing is it's relaying information from one part of the brain to another. We also find white matter here in the spinal cord, and here it's performing a similar function. It's relaying information from one place to another, from either the brain to the rest of the body and vice versa, or from one level of the spinal cord to another. Your white matter is composed of myelinated axons, and you'll remember when we talked about neurons, we said that myelin basically speeds up electrical impulses. It speeds up action potentials. So the function of this type of tissue, again, is relaying information. And just like that, you've reached the end of this video. In this video, I've talked about the two organs of the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord. Remember, the brain, you could think of like as the supercomputer of the human body. It's going to integrate and coordinate sensory and motor functions, as well as kind of be the seat of our higher mental functions, things like learning and memory, emotion. It helps us to plan movements and to think. The spinal cord, you can think of as being kind of like a information highway. Action potentials, sensory information coming from the periphery of our body as well as our internal organs come into the brain via the spinal cord. And likewise, motor signals that would contract our muscles and cause our glands to secrete, well, they come from the brain to our muscles and glands via the spinal cord as well. So it's like a wire, if you will, that conducts electrical impulses in both directions from the brain to the body and from the body to the brain. We also talked about the 4 different parts of the human brain. We had the cerebrum, which is the most superior portion. Remember, it's divided into left and right hemispheres, and it's the seat of those higher mental functions I mentioned a few seconds ago. We had the brainstem, which connects the brain to the spinal cord. It's the seat of some involuntary homeostatic functions, as well as a channel through which impulses coming from the spinal cord get to the brain, and from the brain they go to the spinal cord. We also mentioned the diencephalon, which you can think of being kind of like a relay center. It controls what impulses make it from the spinal cord up to the superior portions of the brain, and vice versa. The diencephalon also is responsible for many homeostatic functions, and it regulates some of our biological rhythms as well. Then finally we had the cerebellum, or the little brain. Remember that its main job is to refine motor movements, especially those that are learned and are repetitive, like the movements you learn when you're trying to play a musical instrument, or when you're dancing and you're doing a special move that you've learned. Okay. We also know that the cerebellum plays a role in refining some of the motor activity that's connected to speech, and there's some indication that it has a refining activity on our actual thoughts as well. So those were the 4 parts of the brain, and you'll want to be sure you know them. The last thing we talked about was white matter and gray matter. Remember, white matter consists of the axons of neurons that are in our central nervous system, and these are myelinated axons. So their main job is to conduct electrical impulses, aka action potentials, throughout the central nervous system. We find this white matter basically in bundles called tracts, and we find tracts in both the brain as well as in the spinal cord. Remember that in the brain, the white matter tends to be internal, whereas in the spinal cord, it tends to be external. Gray matter, on the other hand, is composed of dendrites, cell bodies, and unmyelinated axons. And the job of gray matter is integration, to take electrical impulses and kind of synthesize them into one function or one signal. We talked a little bit about that when we talked about summation in a previous chapter. Remember that your gray matter in the brain is external. If we think about the cerebral cortex, it's completely gray matter, and it's the most external surface of the brain. We also find little islands of gray matter internally, and they tend to be called nuclei. In the spinal cord, the gray matter makes a butterfly shape that's central to the spinal cord. And yes, there is integration that happens in the spinal cord also. So that's it for this video. You should have a pretty good basis or jumping off point for the next videos in this series. As always, if you have any questions about this video or something that I've talked about in one of my other videos, don't hesitate to send me an email or a text. I'd be happy to entertain your questions. So, I'll see you in the next video where we're going to start talking about more in-depth topics related to the central nervous system. I'll see you there.